The snow that stuck overnight to the hedgerows had turned the fields white and slick, and the trees along the road held ice that rang like small bells when the wind crossed them. In the half-light of morning, the men of Company B, 15th Infantry, crouched at the edge of a woodline outside Holtzwihr, France, watching an empty field and a hamlet that had sent fire at them for days. Steam rose from breath and rifle muzzles. A tank destroyer idled on the road, its crew stamping for warmth around the open turret. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy, 20 years old and narrow as a fence picket in his overcoat, walked the line with a field phone in one hand and his carbine slung. He told his platoon sergeants the same thing he'd said all winter. If armor breaks through, fall back to the tree line south and hold. He would keep the radio and call the artillery himself. It was January 26, 1945, on the south rim of the Colmar Pocket. German armor and infantry had been trying to punch out toward the Rhine. The Americans were trying to close the mouth. Company B's position anchored a road that led past a low farmhouse and a sugar beet field hardened by frost. The division wanted it kept. Every hour the enemy sent down mortars to remind them of that fact. Murphy had slept in short bursts across the previous 2 nights, listening for engines, counting the seconds between rounds to guess battery distance, and measuring the way fear worked through a man's hands when he put them to a telephone key. The first shells came sloppy and wide, skidding into the snow beyond the road, then walked closer until the tank destroyer from the 601st, an M10 with a .50 caliber mounted over the open turret, caught shrapnel and began to smoke. The German armor followed the barrage, silhouettes pushing out of the fog along the hedges, 6 tanks with infantry spread between them, moving quick while the artillery had Company B's heads down. Murphy looked once at the tank destroyer crew as they bailed and ran. Then he told his men to pull back to the secondary position. He stayed where the phone line reached. When he called for fire, the guns answered from beyond the river with a discipline that only months of fighting could teach. He gave corrections by yard and landmark, left 50 to the hedgerow, dropped 100 to the road bend, and the shells ripped into the front ranks, but the line kept coming. An enemy tank threw a round that tore into the M10's engine deck and set the thing burning, flames lifting under the winter sky. The enemy infantry were close enough now for voices to carry. The field phone hung from Murphy's neck. He climbed onto the burning tank destroyer, swung the .50 caliber to where the shapes were thickest, and pressed the butterfly trigger. The gun's recoil tried to walk him backward, but he set his boots and kept on. Tracers cut lines through smoke and snow. Men on the road fell and others ran for the ditch and froze there as artillery landed behind them. Shrapnel clipped Murphy's leg. He ignored it and called in another adjustment, then raked the hedgerow again until the belt ran dry. When he changed cans, flames rolled at his knees and smoke carried the smell of hot oil and paint. The enemy tanks kept up their fire but failed to find the exact angle. The M10's hull, already ruined, became his shield and pedestal. For close to an hour, no one timed it in the moment, Murphy stitched the approach, calling rounds so near that the forward observers on the net asked him twice to confirm he was not directing the barrage onto his own position. He told them he was. He watched the enemy line stutter and flatten and tried to count how many still moved between the trees. When at last the infantry in front of him broke and ran, he climbed down off the tank destroyer and limped toward his company's fallback line, yelling for the men to get up, fix bayonets, and push. They went forward through smoke and wreckage and retook the ground they had abandoned. The road and the small farmhouse sat in sudden quiet except for the pop and sigh of things that would burn out by afternoon. In letters and reports that followed, officers would write phrases like single-handedly and stand of exceptional gallantry. Those who stood with him wrote fewer words. They remembered his voice on the phone, the muzzle flash against snow, and the fact that their position did not fall. Murphy spent that night with his leg bandaged and his head full of the day's pictures. answering the questions of men who had seen parts but not the whole. He had already earned decorations up and down the chain, bronze and silver, ribbons with clusters, a distinguished service cross for Sicily and Italy, and the sprint across southern France after the August landings. But the list was not something he carried. He carried the faces of those who didn't sit beside the fire anymore. Laddie Tipton shot dead to his left near Ramatuelle, men he couldn't name from the first months in the mountains. The steady attrition you don't notice until an old joke dies because the last man who told it isn't here. The Medal of Honor that later settled on his chest was full of nouns: company, tanks, enemy, fire, and numbers that people would repeat for the rest of his life. 6 tanks engaged, dozens of enemy killed, an attack by a full company driven off. The citation compressed an hour into a paragraph. The men of Company B did not. They told it as weather and ground, and the way a small man stood tall on a burning machine and refused to move. Before any of that, he had come from cotton rows and red dirt in northeast Texas, the 7th of 12, with a father who went missing more often than he stayed, and a mother who died too young. He was undersized and underfed and precise with a rifle, because meat on the table depended on it. After Pearl Harbor, he tried to enlist at 17, was turned down by the Marines and paratroopers for weight and height, and found his way into the Army at last. He sailed to the Mediterranean a boy and came ashore in Sicily with the 3rd Division, then climbed the Apennines, crossed the Rapido, fought toward Anzio, and learned in each place that the map never matches the ground when you are on it. After Holtzwihr, he returned to the line because the line is where infantry go while paperwork makes its slow tracks. The war in Europe ended that May. By then he was a lieutenant with a face that magazines found too young for the things his record suggested. When he stood in formation to receive the Medal of Honor, he looked shrunken in the dress jacket, as if the fabric were a size too large or the man too small for the way people would talk about him. America wanted a hero it could carry into peacetime. Murphy let himself be carried because there was no other work that made sense yet. He stood in parades, signed photographs, and read lines on a sound stage while cameras traced his profile. In 1955, he played himself in a film version of his war, walking again through the scenes that had carved the grooves in his sleep. Between productions, he woke to the ceiling fan and the old reactions that war leaves behind. He kept a pistol near the bed and tried to make sense of a brain that did not turn off just because the armistice was signed. Doctors called it battle fatigue, or later shell shock. He called it something that did not leave. He spoke about it when there was little public language for such things, and in private he fought with it the way some men fight weather, a force that can only be endured. He did not pretend that the medal made him different from the men he had loved and lost. He said the difference on January 26th was a burning machine to stand on, a phone line that held, and artillery crews who never missed when he called. If there was any secret to it, it lay in the habit of not leaving a post until the last useful minute and the simple arithmetic of distance, wind, and courage that a hunter knows before he ever puts on a uniform. On May 28, 1971, he boarded a small plane for a business trip and did not step off. The aircraft crashed into Brush Mountain in Virginia in poor weather. He left behind a wife, children, a record book thick enough that strangers still read it in offices and classrooms, and a grave at Arlington that draws more visitors than most because his name means the idea people want to have of themselves. Those who fought beside him remembered a thin boy with a hard stare who did his job and asked others to do theirs. Those who never met him remembered the still photograph of a man on a burning tank destroyer, the smoke behind him, the line of his shoulders, and the sense that a single person can, for an hour, hold the weight that would otherwise crush many. The field at Holtzwihr is quieter now than it was that winter morning. Tractors work it in good weather. A stone in the village carries his name and the names of the division that bled there. If you stand where the road bends and look toward the tree line, you can still see how a man would draw a line and tell his friends to fall back while he stayed with a phone and a gun. The snow that once rang from the branches will come again each winter, and the hedgerows will catch it, and the light will fall the same way on the farmhouse wall. What changes is the number of people who remember why the ground matters. Audie Murphy remained what his men needed him to be that day, steady, loud enough to hear over artillery, and unwilling to move until the people behind him were safe. When the shooting ended, he carried the weight forward like he always had, one field at a time, one night at a time, until the war ended and the quieter fights began. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.